Good morning, folks. It's September 20th, 2023, and we're here at Deep Creek Nature Preserve, owned by the Volusia County. And this habitat was purchased in 2010 from the Leffler family, half of it, about 5,000 acres, in order to preserve the watershed for the Blue Springs, and also to provide a buffer for the Deep Creek, which we are not near. The Deep Creek is actually a couple miles to the west of us, and this is an area of one of several different types of habitats that we'll see today. This is mostly pine flatwoods that are disturbed by various practices over the years that are maintained on the property today, which we'll discuss. But for the most part, the Deep Creek encompasses several different habitat types. Pine flatwoods, there are wet pine flatwoods and mesic pine flatwoods, which are a little drier. And there are swamp basins or basin swamps. There are hydric hammocks and cypress domes. And today we're going to see mostly pine flatwoods that have been altered in various ways, which we'll discuss. So the total preserve size is about 8,000 acres, half of which were acquired by Volusia County. The other half were acquired by St. John's Water Management District, and they have entered into a cooperative agreement to manage the land here. The land is managed almost exclusively by the Volusia County land manager. And really the conservation effort here is designed to enhance the habitat that's here already. There are a number of species here that are of concern, primarily the Sherman's fox squirrel, some hooded pitcher plants, two species of ferns, which I'll show you. And so in order to enhance the habitat, they engage in some practices here so that they can restore some of the habitat to its more original conditions. And we'll show you how this habitat is disturbed and some of the ways that they're going to correct it. So some of the early practices that were conducted on this land before it was purchased was silviculture, which is tree farming. There were pine plantations on this property, comprising probably about it was 300 acres. Also grazing has been allowed to occur on the land, and it continues today. There are leases in the area, so that it's actually used as a management strategy to maintain certain ecosystems, eliminating understory grass vegetation. Another activity that's allowed to continue on the land is hunting. Part of the southern portion of the preserve is leased out to hunting clubs, and proceeds from these leases go back into conservation efforts. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how the land has been altered by man's development, and we're going to show you the ways. And another thing that we're going to discuss as we walk through the habitats here is succession. And succession is basically the gradual changing of species over time, leading to one of several outcomes. One is a climax community, and the other way is maintaining an ecosystem with some kind of similarity over time, like a self-maintaining. There are natural self-maintaining factors that keep the species consistent, and that's what we call a well-defined ecosystem. And here you're going to see what's called a mosaic, and there's going to be different ecosystems sort of crossing over into each other. So sometimes it's not so apparent which ecosystem you're looking at. But what we're going to also mention is what's called indicator species. And these are species that are found in an area that indicate that this is a specific habitat type that they're adapted to, and in which they usually only occur. So for instance, if we find a scrub pine which grows in high sandy areas, it's not going to grow in the same area as, say, a slash pine in wet flatwoods, which is going to grow in an area where there's water often on the surface for several months out of the year. So we'll discuss this as we walk along. Here you can see the habitat is mostly looks like former wet flatwoods, in which grass and the understory and shrub layer is growing up. We see a lot of young pines here. So this area was probably disturbed. It is a parking lot, and so this was an area that was disturbed and somewhat restored to its natural state. And so anywhere we see areas of disturbance, we're going to see exotic plants and nuisance plants. So we'll discuss this as we walk along, but this is an area of former wet pine lands, and back here on the southern part, it looks like it might grade into a little bit more of what we call mesic, or slightly drier, moderately dry, wet kind of ecosystem. And sometimes the difference between the two is subtle. So as we go, we'll try to look at the plants and see if we can identify the differences. So as we're walking along here on this road, you can see the disturbed habitat, and the first thing that's going to come into view is this ditch here. What this ditch is doing is removing water that would otherwise stay on this land for a longer period of time, and it's funneling the water down this trail here. And in this ditch we can see species that are more common to wet lands. These are Sagittaria latifolia. They're a pond plant, also known as duck potato, and they grow in partially inundated or continuously inundated areas. You also see some soft brush back there. These are basically marginal swamp plants that grow in areas that are wet most of the year. Further back, you can see it's drier, and there aren't so many, although you can see little pockets of the soft brush back there. Juncus is the scientific name, genus. Now here in this ditch, as we're walking along, we've already encountered some exotic plants that really should not be here. These are Ludwigia peruviana. They're also a invasive wetland plant that quickly colonize disturbed habitats. And you can see this, the flowers have wildlife usage, but this plant kind of develops kind of thickets that crowd out some of the other plants. Now, a wet pine flatwoods environment should be fire maintained, and that clears out a lot of the understory. Wet flatwoods will burn approximately 5 years, and this area has not seen a burn in a while, as evidenced by lack of burn marks on the trees. A fire going through here would clear it out and remove a lot of the shrub layer here, but you can see a lot of butterflies, and even though it's invasive vegetation, it is providing some habitat for these spicebush swallowtails and sulfur butterflies. Another invasive plant you can see occupying this kind of disturbed habitat is Urina lobata, or Caesar weed, and it's a nuisance plant that makes little sticky burrs that stick all over to your clothes. They're a pain to get off. And over here you can see housing. Certain practices are allowed to continue. There are housing and farms surrounding the preserve. And here we can see a nice area of grasses here. It's kind of more consistent with a wet pine flatwoods. And one of the differences that we're going to notice as we walk along here is the presence of oaks. And oaks are the hardwood invaders that invade pine flatwoods in the absence of fire. And here we can see this shrubby oak layer. A lot of times oak also indicates drier habitats, depending on the species of oak. So some species of oak do better in wet conditions, and some species are going to be growing on the drier soils. And it's not that easy at the beginning to learn the differences between the different oak trees, but if you study them enough, you start to recognize some of the differences. So we're going to keep walking along here and get a little further in. A lot of times with pine, it will grow up in open clearings even in the absence of fire. But a fire or prescribed fire greatly enhances the environment by clearing out some of this herbal layer here and allowing the pines. The pines are fire resistant, and if a low-grade fire goes through here, it would not do much damage to anything. In fact, it would just enhance the natural communities. So that's one of the management practices that they use here, is prescribed fire, and they have to use it in a limited manner because of the houses that are so close to the trail here. A lot of times in built up areas like this, they're not too keen on having fires right near the house, so they'll do mechanical chopping instead, or mechanical clearing. But here you can see, even though this area is disturbed, it may have been planted, but the pines are coming up really nice. And there's an easy way to tell the difference between a slash pine and a longleaf pine, which are the two pines here, and that is to look at the fascicles of needles as they grow on the pine tree. And if you pull it off and look, you'll see 3 leaves like this, 3 fascicles or needles bundled together. That's indicative of a longleaf pine. And then sometimes you'll find some that are 2, and those are more often slash pines. And obviously here we have both slash and longleaf pines occurring in the same habitat. Now, if you find a tree like this where you have 3 and then 2, it's almost always going to be a longleaf pine, because slash pines are always in 2. I never find the fascicles in 3. Longleaf pines, you'll find them in 3s and 2s sometimes. So just you have to look at a few of the needles before you can tell. But remember, slash pine fascicles are always in 2. Longleaf pine fascicles in 3. All right, so as we walk along this road here, what we're going to want to start thinking about as we walk along is indicator species. And these are species that kind of point to what the habitat is, what the ecosystem is. As I said, the presence of these pine trees clearly indicates that we're in a flatwoods, and occasional oak trees. So this preserve is actually what's called the mosaic community. So it's like a patchwork of high, drier pine lands, more wet pine lands, cypress domes, marsh basins, cypress strands, cypress domes. So all habitats right now, as you get closer to the river, you're going to encounter more of the hydrocamics and wetter type of habitats. We're on the far eastern boundary, quite far from Deep Creek. So we're really not going to see a lot of the really good swamp ecosystem. Clearly, there's a little bit on this trail, but let's just keep walking and see. There's some dogs over here. So here in this field, you can see some of the native wildflower that loves this time of year. It's goldenrod coming up, and we're going to see some more of it down the road. We've got some andropogon grass growing here. Those are native. That's chalky blue stem, and there's also andropogon glomeratus. And over here we start to see some open. Now, notice the lack of saw palmettos here. Now, if you saw a dense thicket of saw palmettos, you would associate that with mesic pine flatwoods. These are former hydric or wet pine flatwoods. And it's mostly an herb layer with some shrubs, but not a very thick, dense cover of scrub or Serenora repens saw palmetto. On this side, this is the preserve boundary. And it goes for a little ways. I think mostly what we have are a mixture of longleaf and slash pines here. I think they're mostly longleaf. And if you see some of the pine cones, you'll really be able to tell. The slash pines are a lot smaller than the longleaf pines. Have huge pine cones. Okay, so discussing more about succession and conservation efforts here at the preserve. It's important to note that what a climax community is not always obvious or clearly apparent, and land use affects what the climax community will be. So in an area like this, in the absence of fire or any kind of management, what would occur, and is what is happening here, is that you'll still have regeneration of pine lands, but you're going to have invasion by oaks and the habitats. All right, here's a plant that's an indicator of a wetland, a wet flatwood situation. And this is in the genus Rexia. It's Maid Marian. And these are really beautiful flowers here. And the preserve is trying to maintain flowers like this by enhancing the habitat. Now, we're in a ditch right now, but this is at the edge of the wet pine lands. Another species you can see growing here is Solidago, the goldenrod. And this could be one of several species. Goldenrods are very diverse here in Florida, and there are a number of species here. So I wouldn't be confident to tell you exactly what species it is, but it might be pine barren goldenrod or Solidago leavenworthy. You see a lot of the Maid Marian here. You can see some skipper butterflies enjoying their flowers. Lots of bees. So as we walk here, we are entering into a wet flatwoods environment that has been altered by this ditch, which is draining the land and making it drier than it should be. And that absence of fire, in addition to that, has created this dense kind of weedy herb layer around it. And here you can see another invasive plant that we would all like to get rid of. It's called camphor tree. I believe it's of Asian origin, and it's becoming a real nuisance plant around Central Florida, popping up everywhere. Its seeds or little fruits are easily spread by birds. And a good reason to remove a ditch like this is because it does encourage this nuisance plants. Here's another plant that's really interesting that we're trying to conserve here at the Deer Creek, or the Deep Creek. We have the here we have the cinnamon fern, and this is the spore, basically a specialized leaf for spore dispersal. And you can see normally the spores are found on the underside of the leaf, but this fern grows like a specialized leaf with all of the spores on there, and you can see that all over. Here's another one. This is one of 2 fern species of concern here that they're trying to enhance the habitat for. This plant likes its roots in moist conditions. So if the flatwoods were a little wetter, you'd probably have a lot more of this. As it is, it's subsisting only in this ditch because it's the only area that's wet enough. So here you can see across from this disturbed area, pine flatwoods becomes invaded by shrubby layer in the absence of fire or management. And you can see it is not an open understory. It's very kind of clogged up with weeds and vegetation, mainly grapevines, and it reduces the open character. So this is what we would call kind of like a degraded ecosystem. And if left to nature, this will revert to a oak hammock type of environment with lots of invasives in it. It would not be a clearly defined ecosystem. And why is it important to keep these ecosystems kind of intact and healthy? It's in order to support the species that live there, because some of these species have evolved to live only in this type of habitat. And when you change the habitat significantly, it no longer is suitable for that type of organism, and you lose diversity. So by maintaining what I would describe as a homogeneous ecosystem, we're enhancing it for those species which are said to be endemic or found only in those areas. So when we speak of indicator species, sometimes we're talking about species that are found in that area. Endemics are plants that are found only in that area. So where we can have goldenrods growing on higher and drier land, some plants require the specific, not just plants but animals as well, require specific habitat in order to maintain a population. So that's one of the purposes here at Deep Creek, as it's managed by Volusia County. Here's a pretty cool plant that I like. It's in the morning glory family, Ipomea cordata triloba. And Ipomea is the genus of morning glories, and this one, cordata triloba, because of the leaves, which are cordate with 3 lobes. And it produces these really pretty pink purple flowers that usually stay open until midday, and then they can shrivel up depending on how dry it is. But this is a plant that's an indicator of wet pine flatwoods. It likes lots of moisture. This is one of those indicator species that we use. In addition, this fern, Virginia chain fern, it rapidly colonizes burned areas of wet pine flatwoods, and it loves to grow in the wetter areas. Now, as you can see, it's growing in this ditch here. Further up there, not so much, because this habitat is drying out from the drainage here. And as we walk along, we're going to see where this drainage is leading to. Here you can see this line along this disturbed area and road. You can see the soft maiden fern growing here along the margin where it's a little wetter. And again, this is an altered habitat. Now, if you were to fill this in here, you would not have these wetland species right here. However, what you would have is more water on the ground, and these species would be more broadly spread out as opposed to just in this ditch. So what we're doing is we're kind of choking off the water supply for a lot of the wetland plants that would be here, and we're allowing invasion. We're allowing invasion by exotics and invasives. So an exotic invasive is a plant from another land that's rapidly colonizing and pushing out native plants and animals. A naturalized invasive is a plant that's native that unchecked, it will overtake the environment and create a, well, like, as I would say, an unhealthy ecosystem. You kind of see it over here. And when you see an area like this choked with grapevines, and I'll show you some grapevines over here. And they're growing all over everything here, way up into the understory. This really prevents movement of animals, and now it is a food source for animals, so there's benefit to it, but it basically reduces light and availability to plants that would grow further underneath. And also you can see some more camphor trees here invading part of the preserve's management policies to remove these. These are right near the entrance, so these should be easy to get. They come back rapidly after you cut them down, so this is a type of tree that you have to come back and either grind up the roots or have someone come around and keep cutting it as it resprouts. Now over here, it looks like we have a little bit of a hydric hammock environment that's depleted because of lack of water. And the hydric hammock, one of the characteristics is hardwood trees, specifically oaks, maples, holly trees, a lot of trees from like basin swamp type environments. But this area is deprived of water, so the oaks are a little on the small side here. Some of the indication that this was once wetter, or should be wetter, is this fern here. This is Osmunda regalis, or the royal fern. It's found throughout North America, mostly on the east coast up into Canada. And this one, like the cinnamon fern, grows a sporangia, or the spores grow on a specialized leaf that rises up from the base. This plant likes to be in wet soil all the time, wet, rich soil. And you can see here, there's lots of duff layer on the ground of pine needles. So this is an acidic environment, and these types of habitats don't burn very frequently. So oaks are going to thrive in here, and they are. They're competing with the mother oak for light, but they're growing thick here, and they will gradually raise up the level by filling it in with leaf litter, and to the point where it's drier. It'll be hydric, which means soil will be damp, but it will be higher and it will favor some species. So it's just a real small little area. So most of this land, in the absence of fire, is going to overgrow like this and become sort of disturbed hydric hammock. That's what we would call like a climax community. If we were to maintain this by reestablishing, removing the ditches here and reestablishing normal water flow to this area, we would expect nature to perpetuate an ecosystem in which oaks are the dominant player here, and with a variety of native hardwoods, not camphor trees, which are all over in here. So still, the land is utilized by a lot of wildlife. As you can see here, we got lots of skipper butterflies on this Caesar weed, and they don't mind that it's disturbed habitat. They don't care. Honestly, it's not something that has to be done immediately. It can be done over time. But one of the key goals of Volusia County is to enhance this habitat as much as they can, but also to provide a refuge for animals, because a lot of these plants and animals that are common right now, we're losing. And every day we lose a little bit more and more, and to the point where before you know it, species that were once common are gone. I mean, it's an old story in conservation. You know, once common species, through poor management and overdevelopment, are lost. And so here they're at least making an effort to maintain existing uses while at the same time enhancing the aesthetic and biological diversity of this area. So here we're looking at one of the, I would say, the enemy of this preserve here. And this is a canal that was dug that is draining all the land around it. And it's taking this water and it's funneling it right into Lake Ashby. This is a problem because, one, you're depriving the ecosystems here of water. Two, you're creating an unnatural habitat down there and allowing species to invade areas that they shouldn't really be in. And the third reason is that this water quality doesn't have a chance to get better by flowing over the land, which removes pollution, recharges the aquifer, and so forth. So this forms the eastern boundary of the southern part of the preserve, south central part of the preserve. And there's quite a lot of water draining off it here. And anytime it rains, this is where the water goes. So this is changing the habitat and depriving the wet flatwoods of water. Now, as we turn this trail here, we're kind of at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads between wet flatwoods further ahead and a little bit more mesic or drier flatwoods to the right here. So we're going to take a right turn here. I'm going to show you some of the indicators of drier pine lands. And just as before, where I showed you there were indicator species of wetter conditions, over here you're going to see plants that normally inhabit drier conditions. So again, this is one of the results of depriving the land of moisture and water and funneling it off. So we also have this, so we have this ditch running here. It's a very deep ditch. I mean, it's called a canal on the maps. But here you can see a lot of oaks. And the main oak that I see growing around here is Quercus nigra, or black oak, also known as water oak. You can tell by these lobe-shaped leaves that are pretty consistent if you look at it on the tree. Other oaks have a more consistent. Another thing you see here indicating your drier flatwoods is Ilex glabra. This is a very common component in the understory of mesic flatwoods, and you're going to see more and more of it. Basically, this is the main shrub that we would like to see in the understory of mesic pine flatwoods, not oaks. And of course, these are water oaks. These tend to grow in areas like along waterways, so they kind of seem out of place in this area. Here we have a bay tree. Actually, this is loblolly bay, and this is a beautiful tree. It's normally found in wetter flatwoods on acid soils, but we're sort of at an ecotone here, which is the area between one ecosystem and another in which mingling of the species occurs. But as we turn here, we start to see more Sereno repens or saw palmetto. And this plant does not really grow much on perpetually flooded soils. It'll grow on slightly higher areas. It can tolerate flooding, but it doesn't live in areas that are perpetually flooded. So this is an indicator of slightly drier land where we're at. And now here we see some more invasives. We got a philodendron up there and on the ground. And over here we have more camphor tree. So lots of invasion. And these mesic flatwoods actually should burn a little more frequently than wet flatwoods. And that kind of removes all of the understory vegetation. Should keep it open and airy, but with a dense thicket of saw palmetto. And so here we're clearly in a saw palmetto, or we're getting into mesic flatwoods. We're seeing less of these indicator species. We're seeing oaks, ilex, glabra, or gallberry. And here you can see there's an interesting fern here. It's native. It looks so exotic you would think it might not be native. It's called drooping forked fern. Interesting native plant. We've got some disturbed habitat here. Some of the plants we got growing are beautyberry, produces purple berries. We've got some Caesar weed. And back there some andropogon grass. So let's do it like a pine tree needle check and see what we see here. And I see fascicle with 2, so slash pine. And here's another one, slash pine. Here's another one, longleaf pine. So it's kind of hard to tell them apart just by looking at them. Longleaf pines tend to be more gigantic than tall. The pine cones are a good way to tell the leaf, or the pine needle vesicles are another way. But they integrate and they hybridize, and this area was, especially in the areas where there was silviculture practiced, Pinus eliade, or slash pine, was favored over the longleaf pine. And back there you can see a really nice loblolly bay, probably not see it that good. This loblolly bay right there behind the pine. So we're in wet flatwoods that are merging into more mesic here. And I'll show you a really good example of mesic flatwoods here as I turn the corner. Since acquiring the land, the county has endeavored to practice some conservation and management. Some of these activities that they've undertaken include exotic plant database, monitoring for exotic plant nuisances, control of exotics, removal of hogs, which I have not seen any damage here, but they can root up and do a lot of damage. Prescribed burning, mechanical roller chopping, suppressing wildfires in certain areas, some limited harvesting of pine, and study of the ditches and hydrology of the area. In addition, they have established 5 miles of trails, including a footbridge, a trailhead, and outreach and education programs. In addition, limited hunting and cattle grazing is allowed to continue, as well as silviculture activities. Proceeds from these leases and activities goes back into conservation efforts here. So everybody gets a little something out of this preserve. Homeowners get incentives for best management practices, which involve limiting fertilizers and managing animals, like grazing animals on land in ways that prevent pollution from occurring. They get tax breaks. Hunters, the land is preserved in an area where we're rapidly losing acre by acre every day. This area is going to be a buffer, and it's really going to become a sanctuary for all of these common animals that are being eliminated rapidly. The habitats and the animals are disappearing at such an alarming rate. This is right now is going to be safe in perpetuity for the future generations to see a semblance of what we had and what we're losing. So, and also environmentalists and people who enjoy nature get something out of this too, because we're preserving habitat for bears. Part of this plan with managing this land is to create a corridor for wildlife and even plants, so that we want to avoid having islands where, you know, those are basically ecological islands or unconnected areas that are cut off from natural genetic flow in and out of the area, so limiting diversity over time. Hopefully they'll acquire more and more land and connect it here so that we can save some of the animals that they're working to preserve here are the Sherman's fox squirrel, which is the largest squirrel in North America that spends most of its life on the ground, likes oak trees and eats a lot of acorns. And habitat is managed for that. And habitat is managed for what they call DFCs, or definable future conditions. And what that means is that they're trying to establish definite goals that they can measure. And for instance, measuring the population density of these squirrels and encouraging their population is a definable goal. They can go out and they can count these squirrels. They can reintroduce them to areas. Similarly with the cinnamon fern and the royal fern, by enhancing their habitat and, you know, propagating them and getting them to spread, they are increasing the biodiversity and fulfilling one of the conditions that they've defined for themselves. So here we see another ditch draining the land, taking off water. This ditch, I'm going to say it's probably about 20 feet deep, and there's not much water. The water is at the very bottom, and it's probably about 2 or 3 feet down there. So you can see how low the water table is. The ground is mostly sand, and you can see straight ahead we have mesic flatwoods. And as I turn the corner, you're going to see how different that is from the wet flatwoods. That area looks a little less disturbed and is a little more ecologically complete. So we'll turn the corner here and you'll see, but this is draining the land, and I think it's evident from most studies that these ditches do more harm than good. However, the water can be routed and utilized to supply limited needs here. So this is one of the things that they're studying. But most indicators are that ditches should be removed and filled in to allow the ecosystems to reestablish themselves. So let's turn the corner and we'll see this mesic flatwoods. So here's a plant that I associate with more mesic flatwoods, or more upland flatwoods, and that's Lyonia lucida, also known as fetter bush. It's in the Ericaceae or blueberry family, and this is a very common understory component of mesic flatwoods, or drier flatwoods, slightly drier, and it merges into scrub habitats. So if we walk along, we're going to see more plants that are indicator species of mesic or drier flatwoods. And so hopefully I'll find one that's alive. But here's a fern that is indicative of a drier type of flatwoods, bracken fern. And you find this fern in areas that are drier. It looks kind of dead here, so it looks maybe like it's been dry for a while here. So you can see some of this bracken fern frond here. And it's actually doing a little bit better in here. So bracken fern. And it likes to be shaded, but it can tolerate drier soils. I've seen this grow in sand scrub. Different type of fern. You've got the andropogon, or blue stem. Over here, you'll find a better example of it, but we've got a St. John's wort here, Hypericum species. Probably 4-petal hypericum, but hypericum tetrapetalum, I think, but I'd like to see one a little bigger. So here's one of the oaks that you'll find here, more on drier soil than wetter soil, wet sandy soils. Maybe this is a sand live oak. And you can tell by the very waxy, thick leaves and the underturned leaves here, these curled leaves that prevent the leaves from drying out. Also, the leaves are greatly reduced and narrow with some lobes. Usually the leaves grow in little whorled here. Alternate. You can see on this oak some galls. These are usually caused by little wasps. The plant creates this woody structure around it. Back in here near this ditch, you can see another exotic invasive that we would like to get at here. It's Lygodium japonicum. It's Asian chain fern, and it's a colonizer of disturbed areas, wetlands, and it's a real nuisance plant. It's hard to eradicate. I will see it a little closer up somewhere else. All right, so here's another good example of over here. You can see that this, pull back a little here, and you can see in the absence of fire or any kind of management, this wet flatwoods environment here is kind of a mosaic, but I would describe it as a mesic merging into hydric pine lands. Will get invaded by oaks like this and succeed over time to oak hammock climax community with invasives. So that's the future in the absence of land management, is pine lands rapidly invaded by oaks and a shrubby layer that allows for exotics to kind of penetrate, and it also kind of limits the regeneration of the pine tree. So over time, you're going to have more hardwoods coming in here, and you're going to lose the pine lands. So fire is a very important tool here for maintaining the ecosystems, and these communities have evolved with fire, and fire suppression has greatly altered the communities here. And you can see this by all the oaks growing amongst the pines. It's not to say that oaks don't grow with pines, but succession is one of those things that happens whether or not we are involved. And in the absence of water, we're going to dry these ecosystems out, and without fire, we're going to choke them out. So we're starving the land and choking it, basically. So there is life here, and it is a refuge for wildlife, but it can be enhanced, and that's part of the conservation methods that are being employed here. So here we can see a perfect example of a climax community. This is the mesic or pine lands, or open pine lands, pine flatwoods of Florida. And one of the definable characteristics of this environment are these saw palmettos, which form a dense shrub layer in addition to Ilex glabra or gallberry. These are two indicator species that basically define this ecosystem as mesic pine flatwoods. These flatwoods are highly influenced by fire. Fires here happen every 3 to 5 years. That's the ideal regimen for maintaining the health of these environments. And the fires reduce oaks and hardwoods and allow the shrub layer of ilex and saw palmetto to rapidly colonize. All these plants are fire adapted, so they can resprout from the roots. The pine trees are fire adapted even at the young stage, and when they maintain an open understory like this with space between the trees, it prevents very large wildfires from occurring. So multiple benefits to maintain this ecosystem. You can see absence of fire, invasion by oaks, and that's what we call succession. So one of the management strategies here at the preserve is to maintain roads as fire breaks so that they could limit and control fire here. As I said, fire is of great use in maintaining these plant communities. And here you can see, this is one of the drainage areas here that's affecting the overall ecology of the area here. And you can see how an area like this disturbed area or this man-made ditch is allowing exotics. Back there is the lygodium that I showed you earlier, overtaking that hardwood back there. And it'll climb up into the canopy and just choke everything out. So here's another area that's being drained. You can hear the water flowing through this culvert, this giant ditch. And you can see all these ferns growing here. These are all exotic nuisance ferns. It looks like the southern sword fern, but this is actually an exotic called the fishbone fern. How you can tell it's the exotic is if you rip it out and you look at the roots, you'll find these nodules. These nodules store water and give this plant a competitive edge in this environment. And so you can chop these down. You could rip them out, but if you leave any of those in the ground, it just resprouts more ferns. So this whole area wouldn't be here had it not been for this disturbance. In there in the water, you can see plant growing more typical of wetlands. It's buttonbush, Cephalanthus occidentalis, not in flower right now. So when we talk about hardwoods and the flatwoods, you're going to encounter two bay trees in this area that are very similar. One is Persea bourbonia, which is the red bay, and the other is Persea palustris, I think is the name. And normally I associate red bay with very aromatic leaves that when crushed give us a deep smell of bay leaf. But another consistent feature is these galls on the leaves. And my previous experience tends to tell me that when you see really bad galls like this on the leaves, it tends to be more of the red bay. And when the leaves look a little nicer, it's swamp bay. But I'm not an expert yet at telling the two species apart. But this is a Persea or a bay tree here. Normally found in wetter marginal areas of flatwoods. It's a good ecotone plant that you would find between wetter and drier habitats. So as we walk along here, we can see some mechanical disturbance to the vegetation, but just beyond that we see what look like mesic flatwoods in which fire has been excluded for a long period of time. And you can see the oaks taking over, the vines, hardwoods, creating a less open understory and an ecosystem that is less representative of a climax community. Here we have two species of Andropogon that I note here, and this one is, I believe, Andropogon glomeratus, the maritime Andropogon, or maritime bluestem maybe. And you can see these really bushy inflorescences here of grass. These are wind dispersed, wind pollinated. And this is the native grass of Florida. It's beautiful. Andropogon, the name is derived from andros, which means man, and pogon, which means beard. And so the name refers to the bushy flowering stalks. Interesting grass. And you can see some nice saw palm meadow. If you listen closely, you can hear a call. It's a white-eyed vireo. So walking upon this part of the trail here, we see some big oaks. These are probably swamp laurel oaks. And it's a little far for me to show you that. I'll show you the leaves here. So swamp laurel oaks have these kind of elongated leaves. They're not as persistently lobed. I describe them as laurel shaped. And this tree grows in wetter flatwoods where fire is excluded and swamp margins. I would describe it as a wetland, wetland oak. And so that indicates that we're getting into a more wetter habitat. And here we can see cypress trees, which are the first cypresses that we've found so far on our little walkabout. Not many here. This seems to indicate that this area was once maybe a strand, a cypress strand, which is a slightly lower drainage area here, maybe linear. And here we can see the ecotone between a cypress strand and the more mesic flatwoods. So here you can kind of see very, very well what we describe as mosaic community. And so we have some cypress here integrating into dry flatwoods, and then over here more wet flatwoods as we walk back. And so here, some of the things that we're looking at here is basically a land that has been deprived of water, allowing more establishment of slash pine. And slash pine is very tolerant of flooding. So this area was probably at one time wetter, and all of these canals have drained the land and reduced the available habitat for cypress trees. And they're sort of invading and crowding out these cypress trees. Now, if this area was to receive more water and more rainfall, succession would push this into cypress territory. But as it is, it's some competition here, and succession can drive this either way. So if we increase the water flow, we'll have some more cypresses. We increase the fire intensity, we'll go more mesic with this, or more wet flatwoods. But succession is one of those things that can be influenced by many factors. So here we have a very pretty wildflower here. I think it's called blue mist flower. Here we have a pretty flower, blue mist flower, I believe. Here we have a blackberry vine, very thorny, found in wetland ecotones, areas between the wetland and the drier land. This is an important food source for wildlife, including the black bears. Seasonally, these produce a lot of berries, quite extensive areas of these vines. And another plant here we got is wax myrtle. It used to be called Myrica sorifera, but they changed the genus and relocated it into the oak genus. It's indicative of wet flatwoods. Here we have an artificial pond, and there's probably quite a few of these in the preserve. These were probably dug for cattle to drink out of, but that's one of the management practices that they're trying to mediate, is reducing the amount of cattle waste and falling into these water areas, and thereby polluting the water. So areas like this would be filled in or used. Now this is probably being drained off by one of the ditches, but typically this would be filled with acidic water. And here you can see a royal fern here drying out on the edge here. Might not have received rain that frequently, but a lot of the habitats here have. So here in this ditch you can find a wet flatwoods plant that's common at the edges of marsh and wet flatwoods, and it's not in the best of shape right now. It's called marsh fleabane, and this is the flower here, or the seeds. Flowers are pretty when they're peak, they're pink purple. And here's the seeds. These are Cypsella, which is spread by pappus, which are these hairs that carry the seeds on the wind. And this is a really good plant. This is one of the common plants, and when we lose this type of habitat, we lose these more and more, and they become less and less common every day. And there's a number of Florida wildflowers that are becoming less common every day. You can see more closely the Lygodium japonicum, or Asian chain fern. You can see it in this disturbed area near this ditch here, competing for space with the native ferns. Here we have the ladder fern growing. This is a native. We have the soft maiden fern back there. That's a native. We have cinnamon fern here. Looks like you have Virginia chain fern. Here's an interesting sedge. It's Cyperus odoratus, or the fragrant flat sedge. Interesting way to tell a sedge from a rush is sedges have edges and rushes are round. And so if you feel the edge of the stem here, you'll feel this one has an edge, and it's mostly flat. It's kind of three-sided. So that's a sedge. And rushes are round. So here it looks like we have maiden cane here. Rushes are round. Here's one of the more interesting wetland plants that you find in hydric flatwoods. Yellow-eyed grass, or xyrus. It's a very pretty grass, and you see it growing in numbers. You can see this is one of the plants that likes acidic bog-like edges and wet flatwoods. It's a wet species. So this is an indicator species of wet flatwoods. Iris. Tried to grow this, was not successful. So that's our little tour, very short tour of just a very small part of the Deep Creek Preserve. This land is managed not just for the plants, but for provide sanctuary for animals. Animals that are common today, but might not be so much in the future with its pace of development. This area is of critical importance to the Sherman's fox squirrel, which is the largest fox squirrel in North America and is endangered here in Florida. It's also habitat for sandhill cranes, American kestrel, gopher tortoises, otters, American alligators, eagles, of course, and then the more common hawks and a variety of migratory birds utilize this habitat. We saw we heard a white-eyed vireo earlier. We've seen different species of warblers here. And with proper management, it can support a very diverse assembly of organisms. With a lack of management, this area will continue to be invaded by oaks and will succeed to a hydric hammock type habitat with exotics. With proper management, we can create more homogeneous ecosystems that better represent the historical ecosystems and which support biodiversity, which is not discussed enough, but is an important aspect of conservation, is maintaining biodiversity and corridors for organisms to flourish into the future. So, Deep Creek Preserve, 8,000 acres. What we saw today was just a small part of it. We did not see much in the way of dome swamps, basin swamps. We did not see much in the way of hydric hammocks, just a little bit. Mostly what we've seen here are disturbed flatwood ecosystems, deprived of water and fire, two things that are needed to maintain a healthy ecosystem. But with some assistance from us and educated people who support their efforts, this habitat can be maintained and can become a more healthy habitat. All right, that's it. Have a good day. Here's an interesting flower before I go. Elephantopus, sometimes called elephant's foot. And this is a Florida wildflower that you can find the edges of wet flatwoods, and it has these, it's in the aster family. You can see these pretty pink flowers on top of these triangular bracts or leaves. And it has a basal rosette of leaves on the bottom. This plant, you can mow it over and it's going to be fine. Come back. Very hardy plant, very drought tolerant, very easy to grow from seeds. Elephantopus is the genus.